In 1861, the United States turned its guns on itself. Was it a war for freedom or a fight for separation? 4 years. This is the truth.
In 1861, the United States of America stood at the edge of an unthinkable question. Could a nation built on liberty survive its own contradictions? 85 years earlier, 13 colonies had declared that all men were created equal. They had fought a revolution to secure that promise. They had written a constitution meant to bind diverse states into one republic. And for a time, it worked. But beneath the growth, beneath the expansion westward, beneath the rising cities and cotton empires, a fracture widened. Two visions of America were forming. One was industrial, urban, rapidly modernizing. The other was agricultural, deeply rooted in land, tradition, and a labor system that much of the world had begun to reject. Slavery. For generations, it had existed as both economic engine and moral contradiction. Some saw it as essential, others saw it as a stain that could not endure. And as the young republic expanded, every new territory forced the same dangerous question. Would this land be free or slave? Compromises were drafted. Lines were drawn across maps. Political bargains were struck in hushed rooms in Washington. For decades, leaders told themselves the balance could hold. But balance built on tension does not last forever. By the 1850s, the United States was no longer arguing quietly. It was shouting, in courtrooms, in newspapers, in Congress, in the streets of Kansas. Families were divided. Churches were divided. Even political parties fractured under the strain. And then came an election. In November of 1860, Americans cast their ballots in what would become the most consequential vote in their history. The victor was a tall, self-educated lawyer from Illinois, a man with a careful voice and steady eyes. Abraham Lincoln. He did not promise immediate abolition where slavery already existed. He did not call for sudden revolution. But to many in the South, his election signaled something deeper, a future in which their way of life would be surrounded, constrained, and eventually dismantled. Within weeks, South Carolina declared it would no longer remain in the Union. Other states followed. They did not see themselves as rebels. They believed they were defending sovereignty, defending rights, defending survival. By February 1861, a new nation had formed on American soil. The Confederate States of America, 2 governments, 1 land. And in Washington, the newly inaugurated President Lincoln faced a reality no American leader had ever confronted. The Union was dissolving. He could let it go and accept permanent division, or he could fight and risk tearing the country apart. What happened next would determine not only the fate of millions living in 1861, but the meaning of America itself. April 12, 1861. Before sunrise in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, the first shots were fired. Fort Sumter was not a massive fortress. It was unfinished, isolated. A small Union garrison commanded by Major Robert Anderson had held its position there for months, surrounded by growing Confederate batteries along the shoreline. The standoff had been tense but restrained, until it wasn't. When Confederate guns opened fire, the bombardment echoed across the water and into history. For 34 hours, artillery thundered. Smoke drifted over the harbor, and as flames rose inside the fort, Anderson knew he could not hold. He surrendered. No massive casualties, no dramatic last stand, but something irreversible had happened. The war had begun. Within days, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress what he described as an insurrection. His decision forced remaining slave states to choose. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, they joined the Confederacy. The divide was now geographic, physical, armed. On paper, the Union possessed overwhelming advantages, nearly twice the population, vast industrial capacity, railroads stretching thousands of miles, shipyards, factories, established financial institutions. The Confederacy had fewer people, fewer factories, fewer resources. Nearly one-third of its population was enslaved, and yet it possessed something powerful: home ground. Southern leaders believed they did not need to conquer the North. They only needed to outlast it, to make the cost of reunion too high. If the Union tired, if elections shifted, if foreign powers intervened, independence might be secured. And so both sides prepared. Young men volunteered in waves, convinced the conflict would last mere months. Parades filled city streets. Uniforms were stitched in haste. Bands played patriotic songs in town squares from Boston to New Orleans. Few truly understood what modern war would demand. In July 1861, Union forces marched south from Washington toward Manassas, Virginia. Civilians followed with picnic baskets, expecting spectacle rather than slaughter. They believed one decisive battle would end the rebellion. Instead, confusion ruled the field. At the First Battle of Bull Run, Union troops initially pressed forward, but Confederate reinforcements arrived by rail. A Virginian general, Thomas Jackson, held firm under fire, earning the nickname Stonewall. By late afternoon, Union lines collapsed into chaotic retreat, the road back to Washington filled with exhausted soldiers and stunned civilians. The illusion of a short war vanished in a single day. The Confederacy had proven it could fight. In the North, confidence gave way to sober realization. In the South, hope surged. But beneath celebration, a deeper truth settled over both capitals. This would not be settled quickly, and if neither side would yield, how far would they go? Through the summer of 1861, the war spread like a widening storm. In the West, along the rivers that carved through Kentucky and Tennessee, another struggle was unfolding. Less dramatic in headlines, but no less decisive. Control of water meant control of movement, and control of movement meant control of the war. Kentucky had tried to remain neutral. Its citizens were divided, its geography strategic, but neutrality proved impossible. Confederate forces moved in. Union forces followed. The state became a battleground. It was here that a quiet, determined general named Ulysses S. Grant began to emerge. Grant did not carry the theatrical presence of some commanders. He did not deliver grand speeches. He observed, calculated, acted. In February 1862, he struck at Fort Henry on the Tennessee River. Heavy rains had flooded the ground around the Confederate position. Union gunboats pounded the defenses. The fort fell quickly. Days later, Grant moved against Fort Donelson. The fighting there was fierce and uncertain. Confederate commanders attempted a breakout. For hours, the outcome hung in doubt, but Grant refused to retreat. He reorganized his lines and pressed forward. Surrounded and cut off, Confederate General Simon Bolivar Buckner asked for terms. Grant's reply was brief: no terms except unconditional and immediate surrender. It was a phrase that echoed across newspapers in the North. Unconditional surrender. The initials matched his own U.S. Grant. To many, it felt symbolic. For the first time, the Union had secured a significant victory. The Tennessee River was open. Nashville would soon fall. And with each movement southward, the Union tightened its grip on the Confederacy's interior. But in Virginia, the war told a different story. There, General George McClellan commanded the Union's Army of the Potomac. Brilliant organizer, cautious strategist, he built an impressive force, drilling and equipping it into a disciplined army. Soldiers admired him. President Lincoln did not. McClellan saw threats everywhere. He consistently overestimated Confederate strength, and when given opportunity to strike decisively at Richmond, the Confederate capital, he hesitated. In the spring of 1862, Union forces approached within miles of the city during what became known as the Peninsula Campaign. For a moment, it seemed Richmond might fall, but then a shift occurred. A new Confederate commander took control of the defense, Robert E. Lee. Lee had been offered command of Union forces at the start of the war. He declined. His loyalty, he believed, belonged first to Virginia. Now he would reshape the conflict. In a series of engagements remembered as the 7 Days Battles, Lee launched aggressive counterattacks against McClellan's advancing army. Though Confederate casualties were heavy, the Union was forced to retreat from the outskirts of Richmond. The capital was saved. Lee had transformed from an unknown commander into the South's central military figure, and Lincoln faced a painful reality. Superior numbers meant nothing without decisive leadership. If the Union could not bring the war to an end swiftly, then what would victory require? By late summer of 1862, the war had entered a new and more dangerous phase. General Robert E. Lee understood something many in the South were beginning to fear. Defending alone would not win independence. The Confederacy needed momentum. It needed a victory that would shift perception, not just in America but abroad. And so Lee moved north. His army crossed into Maryland, marking the first invasion of Union soil. The implications were enormous. A Confederate victory on northern ground could strengthen Southern morale, influence upcoming elections, and perhaps even encourage European powers, particularly Britain or France, to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate nation. President Lincoln could not allow that. General George McClellan was once again tasked with confronting Lee, and in one of the war's most remarkable twists, Union soldiers discovered a copy of Lee's battle plans, Special Order 191, wrapped around cigars in an abandoned camp. For a brief moment, McClellan held in his hands a rare advantage. He moved to intercept Lee near a small Maryland town called Sharpsburg, along a narrow stream known as Antietam Creek. September 17, 1862. Morning fog lifted slowly over farmland and cornfields. Within hours, the landscape would be transformed. Union forces launched attack after attack against Confederate positions. The fighting surged back and forth across fields, along sunken roads and over narrow bridges. Neither side gained decisive ground. Neither side collapsed. By nightfall, over 23,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or missing. It remains the single bloodiest day in American military history. Lee held his position through the night, but the next day he withdrew back into Virginia. Strategically, it was a stalemate. Politically, it was something else. Lincoln had been waiting for a moment like this, not necessarily a sweeping victory, but a sign that the Union could stand firm. 5 days later, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Beginning January 1, 1863, enslaved people in states still in rebellion would be declared free. The war, which had begun primarily as a fight to preserve the Union, now carried a new and transformative purpose: freedom. The proclamation did not immediately free every enslaved person. It did not end slavery in border states that remained loyal to the Union, but it changed the moral and diplomatic dimensions of the conflict. European governments, particularly Britain, now faced a clearer choice. Supporting the Confederacy would mean aligning with a nation fighting to preserve slavery. Recognition became far less likely. Still, the proclamation deepened divisions at home. Some in the North feared the war had become too radical. Others believed Lincoln had not gone far enough. And on the battlefield, the struggle continued. In December 1862, Union forces under General Ambrose Burnside attempted to cross the Rappahannock River and attack Lee's army at Fredericksburg, Virginia. The assault was disastrous. Confederate troops positioned on high ground repelled wave after wave of Union advances. Casualties mounted. By nightfall, Union soldiers lay pinned against the frozen earth, unable to advance, unable to retreat. The Army of the Potomac withdrew days later, shaken and discouraged. The war was entering its third year, and both sides were beginning to understand the cost. If freedom was now the Union's aim, and independence remained the Confederacy's hope, how much longer could this nation endure its own division? As 1863 began, the war no longer felt distant. It reached into homes, into factories, into farms. It reshaped daily life, and it demanded more men than volunteers alone could provide. The Confederacy had already instituted a draft. Now the Union followed. In March, Congress passed the Enrollment Act, requiring eligible men to serve. Substitutes could be hired. Fees could be paid to avoid service. For working-class families, those provisions felt unjust. Resentment simmered. Yet on the battlefield, momentum was shifting. In the spring, General Joseph Hooker replaced Burnside as commander of the Army of the Potomac. Hooker was bold, confident. He reorganized his troops and restored morale after Fredericksburg. In April, he moved against Lee near a crossroads called Chancellorsville. Hooker held the numerical advantage, nearly 130,000 Union soldiers against roughly 60,000 Confederates, but numbers alone do not guarantee victory. Lee made a risky decision. He divided his smaller force in the face of a larger enemy, something military doctrine warned against. Then, alongside his trusted Lieutenant Thomas "Stonewall" Jackson, he executed a daring flanking maneuver. Jackson marched his corps on a wide arc around Hooker's exposed right flank. At dusk, Confederate troops surged from the forest, catching Union soldiers completely off guard. Panic spread. Union lines collapsed. Hooker retreated. Chancellorsville became one of Lee's greatest victories, but it came at a cost. That night, while scouting ahead of his own lines, Stonewall Jackson was accidentally wounded by Confederate fire. His arm was amputated. Days later, he died from complications. Lee reportedly said, "He has lost his left arm, I have lost my right." The South had won the battle, but lost one of its most capable commanders. And Lee, encouraged by his success, made another fateful choice. He would again carry the war north. By early summer, Confederate forces crossed the Potomac River into Pennsylvania. Their objective was ambitious: relieve pressure on war-torn Virginia, gather supplies from northern farms, influence political opinion in the Union, perhaps secure a decisive victory on enemy soil. In Washington, Lincoln replaced Hooker with General George Gordon Meade just days before confrontation. The two armies converged near a small town called Gettysburg. July 1, 1863. Confederate forces pushed Union troops through the town on the first day, but the Union Army regrouped on high ground south of Gettysburg: Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, Little Round Top. Over the next 2 days, the fighting intensified. Lee believed he could break the Union center. On July 3, after heavy artillery fire, thousands of Confederate soldiers advanced across open fields toward entrenched Union lines. It would become known as Pickett's Charge. They marched into withering fire. Few reached the stone wall at the Union position. Fewer still returned. When it was over, more than 50,000 Americans were dead, wounded, or missing. Lee retreated south. For the first time, his army had been decisively turned back. And almost simultaneously, far to the west, another turning point unfolded. The Mississippi River, lifeline of the continent, was about to change hands. While cannon fire echoed across the hills of Gettysburg, another campaign reached its climax along the Mississippi River. For months, Union General Ulysses S. Grant had pursued a single objective: Vicksburg. The city stood high on bluffs overlooking the Mississippi, commanding river traffic. As long as it remained in Confederate hands, the South maintained a vital artery connecting its eastern and western territories. Supplies moved. Communication flowed. Resistance endured. Grant understood that taking Vicksburg would split the Confederacy in two. His early attempts failed. Swamps, bayous, and Confederate defenses repelled direct assault. Critics questioned his leadership. Some in Washington considered replacing him. Grant did not retreat. Instead, he executed a bold maneuver, marching his army down the west bank of the river, crossing south of Vicksburg and cutting inland. He severed rail lines. He isolated Confederate forces. He forced General John C. Pemberton back into the city. By May 1863, Vicksburg was under siege. For 47 days, Union forces surrounded the city. Artillery bombarded defensive positions. Civilians took shelter in caves dug into the hillsides. supplies dwindled. On July 4, 1863, the day after Pickett's charge, Pemberton surrendered. Nearly 30,000 Confederate soldiers laid down their arms. The Mississippi River now belonged to the Union. The Confederacy was divided geographically and strategically. Two victories, two turning points, within days of each other. In the North, church bells rang. Newspapers proclaimed renewed hope. President Lincoln, who had endured months of criticism and doubt, felt the tide shifting. He would later write that the Mississippi again goes unvexed to the sea. Yet even in triumph, shadows lingered. The war was far from over. In New York City, frustration over the draft erupted into violent riots. Working-class citizens, many of them recent immigrants, protested conscription laws they believed favored the wealthy. Anger spilled into the streets. Black communities were targeted. Federal troops eventually restored order, but the unrest revealed deep social fractures within the Union itself. Freedom, even when declared, was complicated. Meanwhile, African American soldiers were beginning to serve in increasing numbers under Union command. One regiment, the 54th Massachusetts, would soon make history at Fort Wagner in South Carolina, demonstrating courage under fire and reshaping public perception about Black military service. The war was changing. It was no longer only about territory or rebellion. It was about who counted as American, who could fight for the nation, who belonged within its promise. And as 1863 closed, President Lincoln faced another reality. The following year would bring a presidential election. The outcome of the war and his own political survival were now deeply intertwined. If battlefield momentum faltered, would the public's patience falter with it? As 1864 dawned, the war entered its most relentless chapter. President Lincoln faced re-election in November. Peace Democrats in the North argued the conflict had gone on too long. Casualty lists grew heavier. Families were weary. If the Union Army stalled, if momentum faded, Lincoln could lose not only the presidency, but the war's direction itself. He needed a commander who would not hesitate. In March 1864, Ulysses S. Grant was promoted to lieutenant general and given command of all Union armies. Unlike many before him, Grant did not believe in cautious maneuvering. He believed in pressure, constant pressure. His strategy was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Engage Lee's army continuously. Do not retreat after battle. Do not pause. Use the Union's numerical advantage to wear down Confederate strength. In May, Grant crossed the Rapidan River into Virginia. The wilderness, dense forest, thick underbrush, visibility limited, artillery difficult to deploy. It was terrain that neutralized many Union advantages. For 2 days, the armies clashed in chaotic fighting among trees and brush. Smoke mingled with fog. Units became disoriented. Fires ignited in the woods. When it ended, casualties were staggering. And yet, something unprecedented happened. Instead of retreating north, as previous Union commanders had done, Grant moved south. Soldiers understood immediately what that meant. The war would continue. The armies collided again at Spotsylvania Court House. For nearly 2 weeks, assaults and counter-assaults battered both sides. Rain turned earthworks into mud. Lines shifted by yards. The cost mounted. Grant wrote to Washington, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." The message was clear. This would not end through maneuver alone. Lee's army, though still formidable, was being forced into defensive posture. Each engagement drained irreplaceable Confederate manpower. By June, the focus shifted toward Petersburg, a rail hub vital to supplying Richmond. Grant aimed to cut those lines and strangle the Confederate capital. What followed was not a single dramatic battle, but a prolonged siege. Trenches stretched for miles. Sharpshooters watched from concealed positions. Soldiers endured heat, disease, and exhaustion. The lines resembled something the world would see again decades later in Europe. Meanwhile, in the West, another Union commander prepared to deliver a different kind of blow. William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman believed in total war, not against civilians directly, but against the infrastructure that sustained Confederate resistance. Railroads, supply depots, industry. In the spring of 1864, he began advancing toward Atlanta, Georgia, a crucial manufacturing and railroad center. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston attempted strategic withdrawals, trading space for time. But political pressure in the South led to his replacement by the more aggressive John Bell Hood. Hood launched bold attacks. They failed. By September, Atlanta fell into Union hands. In the North, news of its capture electrified the public. For months, Lincoln's prospects for re-election had seemed uncertain. Now, optimism surged. The Union had momentum, but Sherman was not finished. He made a decision that would redefine the war's final phase. He would march through Georgia and toward the sea. In November 1864, with Atlanta secured behind him, General William Tecumseh Sherman issued an order that stunned even some within his own ranks. He would cut his army loose from traditional supply lines. 60,000 Union soldiers would march southeast across Georgia, living off the land, dismantling railroads, destroying warehouses, burning military stockpiles. The objective was not merely territorial gain, it was psychological. Sherman believed that to end the war, the South's ability and will to sustain it had to be broken, not through indiscriminate cruelty, but through calculated disruption of the systems that fed Confederate armies. As his forces advanced, rail lines were twisted and heated into useless spirals. Bridges collapsed, storehouses emptied, fields were stripped of provisions that could support resistance. The march covered roughly 300 miles in just over a month. Confederate forces struggled to mount effective opposition. Hood had moved north toward Tennessee, hoping to draw Sherman away. Instead, Sherman continued unopposed toward the Atlantic coast. On December 21, 1864, Savannah surrendered. Sherman telegraphed Lincoln, offering the city as a Christmas gift. In Washington, the symbolism was undeniable. The Confederacy's heartland had been pierced. Meanwhile, Hood's northern campaign ended in disaster at the Battle of Nashville. Confederate losses were severe. The Army of Tennessee, once a major force, was effectively shattered. By early 1865, the strategic picture was stark. Grant maintained relentless pressure around Petersburg and Richmond. Sherman turned north through the Carolinas, advancing toward Virginia from the south. Confederate resources were exhausted. Rail lines were severed. Supplies dwindled. Yet Robert E. Lee did not surrender easily. Throughout the winter, his army endured hunger, cold, and diminishing numbers. Desertions increased. Still, discipline held. President Lincoln, re-elected in November with renewed mandate, began to contemplate the end. In his second inaugural address in March 1865, he spoke not with triumph but with gravity. The war, he suggested, was a shared national tragedy. Both sides had prayed to the same God. Both sides had read the same Bible. With malice toward none, with charity for all. He was already thinking beyond victory. But on the ground, the final movements were underway. In April, Union forces finally broke through Confederate lines at Petersburg. Richmond fell soon after. Confederate officials evacuated the capital. Fires consumed portions of the city as retreating forces destroyed supplies. Lee led what remained of his army westward, hoping to link with other Confederate forces. Grant pursued. On April 9, 1865, in the small village of Appomattox Court House, Lee met Grant inside the home of Wilmer McLean. The terms were generous. Confederate soldiers would lay down their arms. They would be allowed to return home. Officers could keep their sidearms. Horses could be taken for spring planting. There would be no humiliation. After 4 years, after more than 600,000 lives lost, the principal Confederate army surrendered. The war, in military terms, was over, but the nation's trial was not yet finished, because just days later, another shock would shake the Union to its core. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Washington, D.C. felt almost light. It was effectively over. Richmond had fallen. Robert E. Lee had surrendered. After 4 years of bloodshed, the capital exhaled. Crowds filled the streets in celebration. Bands played patriotic songs beneath gaslit skies. Flags waved from windows and rooftops. For the first time in years, hope seemed louder than fear. Abraham Lincoln, exhausted but quietly optimistic, decided to attend a performance at Ford's Theater with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. The play was a comedy. The atmosphere inside the theater was relaxed, even joyful. Laughter drifted through the audience. It felt like a nation stepping cautiously toward peace. After 10 p.m., as laughter rippled across the room, a single gunshot shattered the illusion. And Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth had slipped unnoticed into the presidential box. He fired at close range. For a split second, the audience froze, unsure whether the sound was part of the performance. Then came the screams. Panic surged. Booth leapt from the box to the stage, shouted a defiant cry, and fled into the night. He was carried across the street to a boarding house, laid on a small bed too short for his tall frame. Through the long night, members of his cabinet, soldiers, and physicians stood vigil in dimly lit silence. Outside, word spread rapidly. Celebration turned to dread. 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. Who had preserved the Union, who had steered the nation through its darkest crisis, would not live to guide its reconstruction. The North, grief replaced celebration. Church bells tolled. Black crepe hung from doorways. In the South, reactions were mixed: sorrow for some, uncertainty for many, and fear among those who had counted on Lincoln's measured restraint. His death left a vacuum at the very moment the nation needed steady leadership. President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency almost immediately. The war had ended, but peace had not yet begun. Reconstruction raised immense and urgent questions. How would former Confederate states be readmitted to the Union? What rights would be guaranteed to formerly enslaved people? How could a nation rebuild trust after 4 years of internal war that had torn families and communities apart? December 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified, abolishing slavery throughout the United States. It was a legal transformation decades in the making, a moral turning point written into the Constitution itself. Freedom on paper did not instantly translate into equality in practice. Reconstruction governments formed across the South. Federal troops remained to enforce new laws and protect civil rights. For a brief, fragile moment, interracial political participation expanded. Black men voted. Some were elected to public office, shaping laws in states where they had once been enslaved.